Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It used to be that people needed products to survive. Now products need people to survive. I found this an interesting quote and timely for today's topic from Nicholas Johnson. Got one more question for you before we get started. What do you think the average forecast there is for new products, measuring at, say, SKU level, 1 month out, or leg one? IBF actually did a study on this, and it's not pretty. If John doesn't cover this in today's topic, wait to the end. We're going to talk about it in the comments and questions at the end. We'll talk exactly what we found in that survey as far as some forecast accuracy and a little bit more. Hello, my name is Eric Wilson. I'm the Director of Thought Leadership here for the Institute of Business Forecasting. I'm speaking to you from the great Commonwealth of Kentucky here in the United States. It's the home of Kentucky Derby, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and bourbon. So you are welcome. Today's live webinar is going to be on new item forecasting and planning, a fact-based approach by the John Gallucci. I believe John will be presenting at the IBF flagship event in Orlando. It's the IBF Business Planning and Forecasting and S&OP Conference, October 20th and 23rd. This is just going to be a taste today of what he's going to be presenting and some of the great content that's there. So I invite you to make plans to attend this premier conference if you can. I'll be there. I said John will be there, and I hope to see you there as well. There's always new faces and people connecting online with IBF for the first time here. And to those, I welcome you. So for those and others, IBF is about you. It's more than an organization. It's a community for practitioners in our field to learn, share, and advance from the help of others practitioners in the field. IBF is recognized worldwide as a premier full-service provider of demand planning, forecasting, predictive analytics. They do education, research, training, conferences, a vast library of content, and the professional certifications of CPF and ACPF. Their next event is an online course over the entire month of September and part of October on a wide range of topics, and thought leaders will go through in-depth on new product forecasting, S&OP, forecasting analytics, and more information. You can go to the ibf.org website and register. Other things going on, I mentioned the event in Orlando, but IBF also has a premier event in the 20th and 22nd of November in Amsterdam, which is equally exciting and informative, which I'll be attending as well. And so if you're across the pond, hope to see you there. A couple real quick housekeeping before we get started. We do invite questions and comments. Over to the bottom or right or whatever on your screen, you're going to see a thing or show answer questions. Put your questions in there. We're going to save them at the end. We'll go through some of these questions and answers. We're going to leave about 15, 20 minutes at the end to be interactive. Please ask your questions, and if you don't hear it covered, we can cover it at the end. It's also important that you'll be presented a survey about an hour after this webinar ends. This is the way you're going to get this content in slide form sent to you. So if you want a copy of these slides, please fill out the survey. About an hour afterwards, we'll give you the slides. But also, we need that feedback from you as well to continue these types of webinars and make sure our content's relevant for you. And we're touching the topics you want to talk about. Finally, there's going to be a special offer after this webinar, so stay tuned to the end. You got to listen to everything John has to say, and then we'll give you a special offer at the end as well. I mentioned John a few times here. John Gallucci is going to be the presenter today. He's a director of demand planning at Bayer Consumer Healthcare. John has over 20 years of business planning leadership experience. He has authored innovative solutions in the areas of S&OP, inventory management, distribution, and network optimization. He's a member of the IBF Board of Advisors since 2008 and served as a speaker on numerous conferences and executive forums. In 2014, the IBF presented John with the Excellence in Business Forecasting and Planning Award. This award is driven by nominations of his peers and demonstrates his knowledge and thought leadership in this field. I think we're honored, and I'm very excited to hear this topic and hear John speak. So with that, I'm going to give the microphone over to John and let him touch on a facts-based approach to forecasting new products. So take it away, John.
Thank you, Eric. Eric, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fantastic.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Good morning, everybody, or good evening, depending on where you are. As Eric said, my name is John Gallucci. I lead the demand planning organization here at Bayer Consumer Healthcare in the United States. Little bit of history. I've been with the Bayer organization since the fall of 2016, so about 2.5 years now with the organization. We've made quite a transformation in our ability to forecast new items, which is what I'm here to cover today. Want to take maybe a brief moment of your time before we get into the content itself, just to talk a little bit about what to expect with this webinar and maybe your approach to it. It's always one of those difficult things to do to listen to a webinar and then say, okay, I've got all these great ideas. And then you say, okay, so what do I do next, right? So maybe just a little bit of advice. It's going to be really difficult to take everything I say and then just sort of airdrop it into your organization. So look for those, 1, 2, maybe 3, really important nuggets of information that really resonate with you, and they'll be different for everybody. Take those, run with that idea, and then look to garner support for that idea, and then start to build around that in your space as appropriate. So let's dive in a little bit here. So new item forecasting, Eric, as you mentioned, a real challenge within our industry, a real challenge within consumer goods in general. And I think if you're in business forecasting or demand planning like I am, like several of my team members who are on this webinar as well can attest, it's a real challenge, and maybe something that inherently, if you're in forecasting, you look on a little bit negatively, right? You say, oh, this is going to really affect the accuracy of my forecast negatively. This is going to affect some of what we're measured on negatively. And I wish, we could just have more stable products to forecast and that's it. And that, I think, myopically makes sense to feel that way or think that way. But the bigger picture here, right, if we back up a little bit and say, okay, so why is our company innovating? Why are we looking to do something different? The reasons are immediately obvious. You have to innovate to deliver consumer needs that are currently out there that are not yet satisfied. If you're able to do that, you're able to grow. If you're not able to do that, you can't survive. So innovation, new item generation, your pipeline, et cetera, is a critical part of running the business. And being able to plan effectively or forecast in this area has been an enigma for such a long time. I'm not going to say I have all the answers. I don't, but I think we've made some pretty important steps here at Bayer Consumer Healthcare in the United States, and I'll share some of those concepts with you. I'm going to put real quick a definition that you would find, let's say, in the dictionary on the screen. You see it now. So take a quick moment and see if you can identify the word that we're describing with this quote. Okay. Just keep that in your mind for a second. Did you come up with the word aspiration? This is the definition of that word, aspiration. Aspiration, generally speaking, right, to say big picture, is a very positively charged word. We aspire to do things as people. We aspire to do things every day when we come into the office or in our personal lives. You aspired to something when you were younger, maybe to be doing what you're doing today and live a comfortable life by having a great job and all these things, right? So it's natural to aspire. It's healthy to aspire. And for a company, aspiration is really about getting to the consumer and meeting those unmet needs and being more important and more relevant to the consumer. So it's very positively charged. So innovation does come from a very good place, a very necessary place. Okay, it does put a lot of pressure on our function in demand planning. That's fine. We welcome that challenge. The question is, how do we handle that challenge? So let's maybe look a little bit more into aspiration itself in business. So how does aspiration affect business? Number one, we know that it's highly linked to strategy. Okay, the company aspires to be something, right? I look at our products here at Bayer in consumer healthcare, right? A lot of self-care, a lot of over-the-counter medicines that are meant to help folks who either have pain or need to feel better because they're not feeling well. Our company aspires to make people feel better when they're in pain. That's our aspiration. It defines what the organization is striving to become. It's embedded in the culture of your company, and maybe not every company, but I would say really well organized companies with a solid culture. The aspiration, what your company stands for, is embedded in your culture. And it is 100% of your company's engine for growth. Even if you're a .com, your aspiration, right, is to meet the needs of your consumer by delivering to them within hours. That's still innovation. That's still an aspiration. It's not part of your organic way of working. It's part of what you aspire to deliver to your consumer. But as we know, this creates variability. This creates uncertainty in our forecasts. And most importantly, if we're not careful, right, this can lead to waste. This can lead to inefficiencies. This can lead to higher costs if the planning environment is not mature. And how does that manifest itself? Well, this can turn into write-offs of inventory that eventually becomes expired or no longer wanted by the consumer. This could tend to restrict your cash flow by restricting net working capital. This could, looking at the other side of the pendulum, maybe result in stockouts if we didn't plan to make enough. And therefore, you have a number of consumers who now want this great new product but can't receive the benefits because it's not available to them. So, certainly a lot of complexity and certainly a lot on the line when we think about forecasting in this space. So, a few charts here just talking about the context, our current business environment, and how complex it's becoming today. Item proliferation is not something that is normalizing or plateauing at all. Customization of items is at an all-time high. How many of you have this situation where okay, great, we create a new product, it's new to the world, but then, customer A needs its own specific variant of that, and customer B needs its own specific, and customer C, and so on. And next thing you know, your one new to the world SKU has 7 or 8 different variants, and you need to forecast all of those accurately, right? This customization trend drives item proliferation, and it's only one example. If we were to look at even new item forecasts by velocity, right, those that become top sellers to those that are what we'll call in the tail of the bell curve, 83% of new items end up in the tail. 83% of new items end up in the tail. And depending on which benchmark study you look at, the percentage of failure of a new item launch in CPG is somewhere between 70 and 85%. So this 83 number makes sense. But think about that for a second. Essentially 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 new item launches at your company will eventually fail. It might bring up the question, why even innovate if we have such a high fail rate? But the answer is, well, you learn from those failures. You learn and you get better, and you come up with better innovation that meets those needs based on what your learnings are. It's an iterative process. But through that iterative process is where this waste typically comes in, right? So through those failures, through having to deal with now maybe too much inventory and how do we plan for this, we eventually get to the right product offering as we continue innovating through the pipeline. So clearly a challenging environment. And the last point is items that start in the tail, stay in the tail. And this is pretty much a proven fact, as if you launch a new item and that item is not a top seller in the first 6 months, there's a very, very slim chance that it will eventually just become a top seller out of nowhere. So items in the tail stay in the tail. So it becomes very difficult to, let's say, consume through some excess inventory. Hope's really not a strategy in that case. Let's take a look at bias and get down a little more into our world specifically, right? As a consumer goods industry, we have a double-digit bias on new items across all velocity categories. And, you know, this chart here is a little bit dated, but it's still very relevant, even if you look at today's benchmarks as well. I love the fact that, you know, no matter what type of item you're looking to forecast, the bias is generally fairly positive. I think we all sort of see and feel that that bias. But if you look at new items specifically, regardless as to whether it's a top-selling item or a tail item, the bias is typically double-digit bias. So very aspirational. Well, that makes sense, because we're, you know, again, trying to meet these consumer needs, and we feel like we have a home run product, so to speak, that can do that. So where can these negative byproducts of aspiration impact business performance? And why do we have double-digit bias? Number one, we believe we have a game changer. We have a lot of momentum into the project, right? So this is something we started 2 or 3 years ago in terms of development, and here we are about to launch it. And of course, we have to believe it's going to be incredibly successful. We put all this time into the development. We believe the innovation will catch on right away. We believe it's going to, you know, sell 10 units per store per week. So clearly on day one of it being in retail, it's going to sell at 10 units per store per week, right? Maybe not. But that's a little bit of the planning assumptions that sort of creep into these forecasts sometimes. I'm pretty sure you've all seen that. We have an incredibly talented team. We have a great R&D team here, right? So we believe strongly in what they're doing. We have strong marketers here. We believe that this team is creating phenomenal products. We've war gamed the launch many, many times. We've been around and around on exactly what scenarios might be out there, how do competitors come in, how do they play or respond, and we feel like we've done enough testing in that area to feel like we really know what the forecast should be. We have great brand equity, right? We put our brand on this launch. People are going to buy it because that's our brand. All right, a lot of really good reasons to feel really bullish about our new item forecast. Then there's this one. We have to hit a number. So how many of you have, and silently you can take your own voting poll here, how many of you have seen a new item launch where the forecast is the number that's required to make the project move forward? So that could be a part of the aspiration as well. Hey, we needed to get it through the stage gate process, and if I didn't show $3 million a year or whatever the hurdle is, it wouldn't have passed and the project would have died. Right? So there's a lot going on here emotionally around new item forecasts and why we tend to run into trouble in terms of the results of new items. We have all this momentum, all this aspiration, all this belief, and then on the flip side, you have that really high failure rate, right? So that tends to become a recipe for disaster. So how do we gain the benefits of all the aspiration, but minimize the risks? And that's really the big question. And that's where we started here at Bayer. That's the question we started with. Like, we're not going to try to question the aspiration. We want the aspiration. We want the ideas. We want the innovation. The question is, how do we minimize the risk? If we could figure out how to minimize the risk, then even with a higher failure rate, the impact to our business, the impact to our financials will be a lot less. So it's an interesting question to start with. And if you're looking to do something like this in your company, this is the question you want to start with. And maybe get some cross-functional folks together and just start talking about, what it would take to minimize those risks. So some of you who know me, I know many of you don't, but some of you who do know that, people who are, give or take my age, maybe a little older, grew up around classic rock. So I like to come up with visuals that stick in your mind. And I came up with a couple classic rock-based metaphors here for different ways to approach new item forecasting. So the first one is the Fleetwood Mac approach. And if you don't know who Fleetwood Mac is, you should probably Google them or look them up on Spotify. Definitely recommend this band. However, their approach is not good if you're forecasting new items, because their famous hit song was called "You Can Go Your Own Way." You don't want to have a new item forecasting approach where everybody's sort of going their own way on creating the forecast. Yet, I can tell you here at Bayer, when I started, this was a lot of the approach, and it's not unique. This is something I've seen in consumer goods companies throughout my career, and I feel like we've been fighting the tide on this type of approach. So what do I mean by that? Well, your marketers say the forecast is going to be 1,000, and maybe that's the hurdle rate it has to be. I don't know. The sales management folks here in my corporate headquarters are saying 750, but the field team themselves are rolling up to 675. Right? And you're going, well, that's pretty far off from that 1,000 the marketer said. Then demand planning says, well, we're kind of in the middle somewhere with the voice of reason. Finance has a different number. The volumetric forecast, maybe bases or something else, comes up with something totally different. The leadership team's walking around saying 900. Some guy down the hall is like, no, you guys are all wrong. This gets to a point where everybody is saying something different based on what they believe. Nobody's on the same page. And if you're in supply planning and you're sitting there listening to all these different folks talk about the forecast, how are you feeling right now? What do you believe? How do you create a supply plan that's going to go back to our original question of minimizing the risk? You can't minimize the risk because you don't know really what your starting point is. Okay, this is a challenge. So if your company, if your organization right now has an approach to new item forecasting that looks like this, I would ask that you look for a way to challenge to a new way of thinking. And I'll give you just maybe, I'll expand on it for another minute or so. So here's kind of what we were doing with new item forecasting back a couple years ago. It's what I've seen in a few other companies as well, right? So you had the marketers that were coming up with their kind of the quote unquote national or global forecast, if you will. And it was based on, some volumetrics data. It was based on some other insights that they had from, whatever sources they could find. Maybe they looked at some benchmark items and they said, hey, the forecast is 1,000, per month or whatever it is. And then the sales organizations were a bit myopic, right? So the Walmart team, for example, would say, well, my Walmart forecast for this new item is going to be, X. And then the Target team or the CVS team, or pick a customer in whichever region you're in, right, would say these other numbers. And, we could, in demand planning, add up all the sales accounts and say, okay, well, their forecast is something else. But you can see really quickly how even with all of that information, right, all these perspectives, all of this data, so to speak, you can't really draw a conclusion as to what the forecast should be, right? All you can do is take some perspectives and then determine, okay, I have a range of perspectives. But if you're in demand planning, if you're trying to create a forecast, you're trying to work with the supply chain to support that forecast, it's really hard to dial that in. Because what ends up happening is you pick a number, nobody's accountable for the number because the salespeople say, well, my number was this Walmart thing, and the marketers say, well, my number was this volumetric thing, and it wasn't what you sent to supply, and now we're out of stock, or now we have waste, and hey, planning folks, this is all on you guys. And fingers are pointing everywhere. It's not a good way of working, okay? So one of the things that we did here is we said, okay, this approach, the Fleetwood Mac approach, is not the right one for our business. We need to move on and do something better. What's better than Fleetwood Mac? Well, I think the Beatles would probably be my first choice, right? As iconic as they were. Their famous song, Come Together, little bit of a different approach to new item forecasting, and one I like a lot better, right? How about a new item forecast approach where we all get together and leverage the expertise of each function around each input that they can provide, and then pull all those inputs together into one forecast that we can house in demand planning and help manage. That's really what we're thinking here. So marketing, give us some key inputs around benchmark item velocities and ramp ups of the consumption data or the sellout at retail. Sales, tell us what's going on, what you think is going to happen at your accounts, how many stores are we going to get into, how many units per store are we going to pipe, when does that pipeline happen, what is demand planning, what do we think the retail inventory kind of builds and burns will be around the pipeline as we then get into equilibrium. And let's start kind of taking all those assumptions based on everybody's expertise and then pulling them together, right, into one common projection that we can all get behind and say, okay, this is the output of all of our best thinking. That creates a consensus. Okay, I'm not a big fan of the word consensus, but I'll use it here. Creates a consensus forecast. We're all behind it. And then we send that output, interesting, not just to supply chain, but also to finance and also to leadership, right? So they're not walking around with different numbers. We're walking around saying, hey, I know the original business case might have been 1,000, but as we pulled everything together, our latest thinking collectively is now 1,200 or now 800 or whatever the case may be. And here's why. These are the assumptions in our forecast. So that leads a little bit into our new approach here at Bayer. And I'll show you, just so you know, the slides I'm going to show you, they do have data in them. I'm going to call it quote unquote dummy data. I can't show you our actual information, but you'll at least get to see a little bit as to what the model looks like and you know how we're thinking through some of the inputs I just mentioned. A little bit of background, between 2015 and 2017, we had a huge issue with write-offs in U.S. consumer healthcare here at Bayer, driven by the inaccuracy of new item forecasting. I can't disclose the numbers to you, but I can tell you it was in the tens of millions. And obviously these are funds that, you know, just kill our bottom line. They could otherwise be just any savings could be dropped to the bottom line as profit or reinvested to drive growth. So we came up with this new approach. Accountability of compiling and vetting the forecast now in demand planning and reaching out to different functions for their own expertise for each input. Vetting input assumptions using benchmark data and customer intelligence. Retail inventory planning and tracking at the customer and SKU level. And one owner for the process. We get it, the commercial team owns the forecast. That makes sense. But who owns the process around new item forecasting? We've created clear ownership. As a matter of fact, we have a dedicated role in demand planning for new item forecasting. One person who's managing this process for us and helping with every new item forecast along the way so that it's consistent in approach and we can get the results that we desire. What are the inputs that we are looking to bring in? Consumption or sellout drivers, right? So what are the things that are driving consumer behavior? ACV assumptions, ACV, all commodity volume. This is your distribution. So how many stores do we expect to be in at Walmart, at CVS, et cetera? pipeline assumptions, how many store cases per store or units per store do we expect to be shipped in the initial pipeline shipment. Display information, so are we shipping secondary placement displays? What does that do to retail inventory? How does that eventually sort of work its way down as we go? And we do this at the SKU key customer level. We also model to retailers target weeks of supply, and I'll show you that, and we'll get into that more in a second. We run sensitivity analysis. So we're looking at our own weeks of supply projections, and we're thinking, okay, we know we've all agreed to this one number aligned forecast, right, using the Beatles approach. But what happens if, we're 25 or 50% lighter on the forecast? What does that do to our risk profile around write-offs? What if we do 25 to 50% more volume? What does that do to our possibility of stockouts? And then we have the collaborative discussion with the supply chain team around risk mitigation, right? How do we want to plan supply? And that's where we get into expedite and de-expedite decisions. And this is done through meetings that happen with a high level of frequency with a lot of our new items. It's either bi-monthly or even weekly, which is, as I mentioned here, at least 4 months into the launch. This is just an example here of a partial list. So when we create a new item, we have what's called the new item dashboard, is our modeling tool, so to speak. This is actually right off the kind of the inputs tab. It just tells each function who's responsible to bring which input into the model. So we're being very clear about the accountabilities that, the velocity of a benchmark item is clearly marketing's responsibility. We need that for marketing. The distribution by customer, that's clearly sales' responsibility, and so on. So as we start to compile these inputs, as I have my dedicated new item forecasting person and demand planning helping to gather these inputs, along with the commercial teams that sort of own the forecast, we know exactly who we're asking for which information. We're very clear about that, okay? And that's really important. So this is a coffee cup. I'm going to digress for just a quick second because I think it's important to make this specific point. I want to do it with a story because I think stories are easier to remember. It's a little bit of a personal story, maybe a funny one. One of the great things about the Bayer office here in Whippany, New Jersey, is that we have a Starbucks in the building, which is really convenient between meetings and long days. So my routine is every morning I go down to Starbucks and I get a cafe Americano with a double shot of espresso. That's what I like to drink. If you don't know what that is, basically 2 shots of espresso coffee, which, that'll get you going in the morning, get you energized, and then basically filled with water. I drink it just like that. It probably tastes like rocket fuel, but that's fine. It works. I'm off to start my day. I feel energized. I'm ready to go. One day, maybe I was tired. I usually have that double shot of espresso in that coffee cup around 8:45. One day around 10:30, I felt like I was still dragging, and I was walking by Starbucks, and I said, I could use another coffee. So I went to the lady at the register, and I said, can I get a Cafe Americano, but with only 1 shot, not 2? And she said, okay. Problem was, the lady making the coffee didn't hear what I asked for, and she just knows that I always stop there, so she made my normal double shot instead of the 1. And I take the coffee, not knowing the difference. I sit down, I'm firing through emails, I drink the coffee, not realizing that I now have even more caffeine than I could imagine, right? So you're all forecasters. How much more caffeine do you think I had that morning? What would be your guess? Probably 0, right? I was probably overstocked on the amount of caffeine I had that morning, and my chances of having any more, maybe even for that day, maybe even that week, was pretty slim, okay? So it's a little personal story. Maybe it's a little funny, but I draw the comparison to new item forecasting in the way that pipeline shipments for our new items end up going into the retail trade inventories. Okay, so this is a bit of an eye chart, but let me see if I can explain. This is, again, the data is not real, but this is a piece of our modeling. And if you look at the top here, you see under the bar that says Walmart, you can see in the third row down, we have pipeline shipments, and we're shipping in 432,000 units, then in April, again, another 300 plus. So we're putting all this inventory into Walmart when we first launched the product. Now, if you look down at where it says weeks of supply, where you've got that conditional formatting, they want 7 weeks of supply, but we've already loaded them up with all the way up to 11.4 weeks, our second month into the launch, right? So going back to my caffeine story, how much more inventory is Walmart going to take of our new product in the third month? Well, they're not going to take any. But this is something that's missed all the time in new item forecasting. And I can feel everybody shaking their heads, kind of nodding on the other side of the phone, because it's something that is really simple to identify, but not something we often talk about, right? We say a new item is going to sell 10 units per store per week. So, of course, we go ahead and we forecast from the very beginning of the launch that it's already at 10 units per store per week. Well, that doesn't happen. Look at the consumption row, right? The second row there, where you see, in March, it's only 12,000. In April, it's 38,000. In May, it's 64. And then finally, it builds up. We recognize in our models, and these are through the inputs I get from marketing in this particular case, that consumption is going to build gradually. Shipments, on the other hand, well, we're sending a bunch of product into their facilities, their stores and their DCs immediately. So it takes several months for the consumption to ramp up or the sellout to ramp up, and for the inventories at retail to ramp down to get to a point where they're at their targeted weeks of supply, their target inventory levels. So you get this little lull going on. If you look right below that, here's our model for Target. You see maybe not quite as significant as Walmart's inventory reduction, but there is the month of July where there's no shipments. And then we aggregate all of this individually by customer, Walmart, Target, CVS, et cetera, to where you get to the SKU total. And the shipment line of the SKU total, that's essentially the demand plan. That's how our demand plan is created. We're looking at the pipeline coming in. We're looking at the retail inventory drawing down. We're looking at the sellout building over time. And these are all based on the assumptions that we get from marketing, from sales, from internal sales management, from demand planning, and so on, right? All this stuff, the Beatles approach, right? We pull all of this together. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit of a different approach to where we were historically. And then what we do, and this is really hard to read, but you'll get copies of this this slide. We then do scenario planning with the supply chain team. So if you look at the box on the left where it says supply status, 100% of forecast scenario, the column in blue, that is our current production plan. We're going to make this many units, or we're going to have this many units available to ship to our customers. Where it says shipments, that's basically the demand plan you just saw, but split into weekly buckets. And then you see, if you look to the right, a 75% scenario and a 50% scenario. The production stays the same in both scenarios, but the forecast, the shipment forecast, is reduced by that amount. And then as we start looking at our own weeks of supply, kind of the far right columns there of each of these three scenarios, it starts to tell us how quickly will we get into a situation where we're writing off product, where our weeks of supply get so high, we have a real issue. And then on top of that, we ask marketing for one more piece of information to help us sort of risk mitigate between demand planning and then what supply planning wants to do to support. And that is, tell us the probability of each scenario, right? So in this case, they're saying, yeah, there's a 50% chance, we've hit the forecast, we'll hit the forecast dead on. but a 30% chance maybe we'll hit the 75% of the current forecast. So like if we don't get the budgeted spend, we're just not going to hit our forecast, and we don't know if we have that spend yet. There's a 5% chance we can only do half the forecast if we don't get that spend. Oh, and there's also a couple of distribution assumptions we're waiting to hear if we even got those. There's also a 15% chance that we might actually overshoot the forecast at a clip of 150%. That's if we get all the distribution above and beyond our wildest dreams, plus, you know, our budgeted media spending overperforms expectations. So what does this tell us? So as I'm sitting in demand planning now with our supply chain team, this tells us, yeah, we're probably weighted a little bit toward risk, right? We're probably weighted more towards that 75% scenario. And we're waiting on a couple of really specific pieces of information. So this helps us to decide how much inventory should we be building for the initial pipeline fill, for the initial replenishment orders, so that we don't just take this magic formula that maybe some of you guys have used in the past of, hey, just build 3 months worth to start a new item launch, or 6 months worth, or whatever your rule is. This is a fluid conversation based on what we know and what scenarios are most likely to occur. And then we mitigate the risk this way. We expedite, de-expedite. We make decisions around what we're building initially based on these types of probabilities in this model. So obviously, the creation of the forecast, right, the Beatles approach of collecting all this data, it's a lot of work. I'm not going to lie. Weekly meetings for a lot of these SKUs, it's a lot of meetings. I'm not going to lie. Doing these expedite, de-expedite discussions with our partners in supply planning, a lot of work. Okay? We put a lot of effort into this. We really do. But the results are really good. Again, I can't give you the numbers, but in 2018, which is really the first year that this process was able to reveal itself in terms of results, we reduced new item forecasts by over 70%. 70% in 1 year. It's amazing. It's amazing. It's a lot of money for our division. It was one of those really kind of nice surprises, so to speak, that helped us out last year. And, you know, as we're now budgeting in this year, of course, you know, our budget says, okay, we need to do even better than that. So we're budgeting for further reductions in 2019. We're on track against those budgets as we stand today. We do write off a little bit of product here and there. We do every now and then have one item that we may launch an allocation if we feel like it's a little tight. I mean, these things do still happen. I'm not going to lie. We're not perfect. But what was a widespread, significant issue is now a little bit of fine-tuning here and there. In summary, before we open up for questions, just a few key points. Aspiration defines what the organization strives to become. It's a good thing. Innovation is the engine to get there. We all need to rally behind these aspirations. It's what makes our companies grow. Innovation has many benefits, but it also comes with uncertainty. And it's how we handle that uncertainty that determines how successful we are in planning around these innovations. Minimizing the risk of innovation launches by leveraging functional expertise, i.e. come together, right, the Beatles model, and getting to a one-number forecast is our solution to try to refine the parameters by which we plan. Create clearly defined accountabilities for each forecast input. Our sales team knows exactly what they need to deliver to us for new item forecasting. So does our marketing team, etc. And we have a forum to share these insights, pressure-tested demand plan. And I'll go back to, look, weekly meetings. Sometimes they're a real pain. Who wants to go to a weekly meeting on new item forecasts every single week and have that take up, you know, half an hour of your week, when it's saving the company tens of millions of dollars or whatever it may become? Might be the most important meeting you attend. Probably doesn't feel that way in the meeting, but when you look at the results, significant. Focus on the pipeline build, focus on the sellout or consumption velocities, but always factor in the post-pipeline inventory burn, sort of that inventory ramp down that has to occur before the retailers get to equilibrium. Run sensitivity analytics between demand and supply planning. Okay, we look at ourselves, by the way, as the same team. You know, it's not about the demand plan throwing the forecast over the wall to the supply chain team and then the supply planner saying, okay, we need to create something. It's literally us sitting together saying, how do we minimize the risk, right? We know that there's variability on the demand side. By the way, there's variability on the supply side too, right? Especially when you're producing a new item. So how do we minimize the risk? And it's a fluid, ongoing conversation. Hold hands cross-functionally on all expedite and de-expedite decisions. I didn't touch on this yet. So we make a decision to de-expedite production. That's done across planning, marketing, sales, finance, etc. All of a sudden, let's say there's an uptick in sellout or consumption, and now we've got a temporary out of stock. This is not on the planning team. This is something we collectively made a decision on. We're all holding hands on those assumptions, and now we say, okay, collectively we need to solve the problem. So a better approach around that. We meet as frequently as needed because the impact of getting it wrong is too great. Again, these meetings might be the most important ones that are going on. And that's it. That's the content that I had. Eric, I'm going to turn it back over to you to open up Q&A. I'm really excited to see what questions we have and happy to provide as many answers as I can.
Great job, John. And we got a lot of questions coming in.
Awesome.
Keep asking them on the side. You could ask the questions. But there's some great dialogue, great assumptions made here from some of the people listening in, and I said some good questions as well.
Great.
You mentioned that Fleetwood Mac approach using their song. I figured you might use their song "Dreams," which might be another one. Yeah, and then Sandra actually chimed in, one of the attendees, and said another great analogy would be Prince's song "Let's Go Crazy." So I kind of like that one as well.
Yeah, that's when the Fleetwood Mac approach looks good. It's when you're in the Let's Go Crazy area.
Yeah, in the Prince's song "Let's Go Crazy" approach. There you go.
I love it.
I said it was a great presentation. I learned a lot from it, and there was a lot of great those nuggets you talked about taking out of this that I was able to get. I mean, kind of if I had to sum it up, I think traditional approach of bottoms up, or looking at just like items, and traditionally how you look at approaching and forecasting. I think what I'm understanding is you need to better understand those drivers of new product forecasting as a new starting point. Is really what we're looking at here.
Yeah, that's it. It all comes down to making sure you understand the drivers, and then understanding they're going to move and they're going to change on you. And the kind of the buzzword, if I may, around new item forecasting for us is around being proactive, right? We want to be able to sort of understand the scenarios based on these drivers. We know which ones have variability, and they can be different for every launch, by the way. But we really get a sense as to where the variability lies, and we're able to kind of play through the variability scenarios and then say, okay, what puts us in the best position to mitigate that risk? But it all does come back to understanding what's in those specific drivers of demand, which is, of course, a lot different than rolling up the total Walmart forecast and the total Target forecast, et cetera, and saying, okay, I've got some numbers to work with, right? It's just a different mindset.
Okay. As you can see on the kind of the summary slide or the end slide here, there is a special offer. I said there's a special offer at the end of this presentation. You get a discount if you enter that code and come to the IBF conference in Orlando. So I hope you can take advantage of that. Getting right into the questions, because I think there's going to be too many questions, unfortunately, for you to answer. Which is a great thing, because I'll send you these questions afterwards, John. If you have the opportunity to answer any of them, that would be fantastic, because I said there's a lot of great questions here, and I won't be able to ask them all.
Sure.
But getting right into a few of them, you talked a little bit about the pipeline shipments, how important is the POS or customer inventory play into your forecast after launch?
Yeah, I didn't talk about that here, but it's a great question. So it's critical. One of the things that we do, and I did mention that these weekly meetings or sometimes biweekly meetings, um, after we launch a product, one of the things that we do is we look at the sellout, the consumption, and we are comparing it to what we predicted, right? So we've got a ramp-up curve that we're expecting consumption to be at, and we have retail inventories that we expect the retailers to have. So as we get into the launch, obviously, the best laid plans, right, as the old saying would go, never materialize. So we start to modify. Okay, are we underperforming what our consumption forecast was? Does that mean we need to further de-expedite, right? Does that mean like, hey, when are we producing this again? Because it looks like we're light on consumption. Oh, we're producing in 3 weeks? Hey, can we bump that production out a month? And that'll give us, a few more weeks to really look at these trends and see if maybe things turn around. So, like I said, it's an iterative process, but that all plays into understanding what's going on in consumption versus the forecasted consumption. And then also the derivative of that is, right, how much inventory is at the retailer. If consumption is not flowing through as we would expect, if it's lighter, then obviously the retailers have more inventory to work down as they go. So, as we look at this being the connection of one great big supply chain from ours into the retailers, we don't want to be building more inventory on our side if there's already more than enough out there, right? So we're going to start to get into that de-expediting conversation. But that's all sort of post-launch tracking that we're doing.
Okay. And the come-together approach, is it including finance?
Yes. It does.
Who else is at the table then, too? Yeah.
Yeah, finance at the table. They don't necessarily have inputs. There's really nothing there's no driver I'm asking the finance team to bring in, at least not off the top of my head, but they are in the room understanding what the implication of the forecast is, because that new item forecast, obviously, these items have their own P&L. They work their way into the greater P&L for the brand. Also, from a revenue standpoint or profitability standpoint, they could affect, the roll-up for the division, right? We thought we were going to get, $10 million annually on this new item launch. Now we're going to get 12, or now we're going to get 7. So having them in the room is important because we all need to be on the same page.
Okay. I know James Breyer had a question. He's dealing with a new company and a new role down there. So his question is more about budgeting. Could you come across the different scenarios? The budget, or how are you budgeting the upside or downside to the forecast? Are you looking at including expediting cost, risk, and opportunity? Are you putting these things into a budget, or is this more just for supply planning purposes?
It's more for supply planning purposes. It's a great question. I think that's an end state that we would love to get to. We're certainly not at that point in our evolution, but, I can certainly see that being, an aspiration for us as we innovate the process further. As for right now, it's really more of a supply chain exercise, and then budgeting is based on the initial forecast. So we take a snapshot 6 months prior to all launches that we deem to be I'm going to call it the official kind of forecast for these new items, the one that we kind of draw the line in the sand and say, based on what we know, here's where we are, and then our budgeting, would likely use that forecast, and it depends on when the budgeting is being done versus when those projections are being created. That all factors in as well. But we look to do something like that, and then we don't go back and revisit it in the budgeting process, but we just do it through the supply chain planning.
Okay. So we got time for a couple more questions here. One question that's coming up a lot in a lot of different forms is when you talked about the probabilities. You said, here's the different scenarios and here's the probabilities we put on it based on some external or internal factors.
Yeah.
How are those probabilities coming up with? Is there some statistics behind it? Is it gut feel, marketing? Who's coming up, and how are those probabilities formulated?
Right. So we really lean on the commercial team to give us those probabilities. There's nothing, new item forecasting is funny like that, right? It's really hard to put anything statistical into play and have it be kind of a believable input. Maybe if you have a line extension, and you're using a like item, there is some use for it. But what that unfortunately means is that it's more judgment based. So we go back to our commercial team and we say, look, based on the different scenarios that we've run, which ones feel like they could be real and why, and then we look at what the shift would be in the driver set to get us from the 100% scenario to the 75 or the 150 or whatever it is. So we're really leaning on them to guide us. Maybe not like the optimal approach, I'll admit, but it's worked for us so far.
Okay. I actually got a question here from Dr. Jane.
Great.
So important question here. Is it true that strategic planners come up with new products, including the line extensions, and then the S&OP team, or I guess in your case, the demand planner that specializes in forecasting and introduction, are they the ones just to launch them and manage their demand? So is there that distinction between the strategic aspect of the company in new product creation and then the execution of it? You kind of alluded to that at the beginning with the emotion. Is that true?
Yeah. So sometimes. It's a great question. So actually one of the things we were looking at very recently and we haven't executed on yet is how far into the stage gate process should our planning organization go? Right now, we really start this process during the phase that I would call commercialization. So, things are sort of locked and loaded. We've made the go, no-go decision. We're moving forward. And then we start, to collect this data. So Dr. Jane's question is a really good one, which is, well, should we be further along or upstream in this in the innovation or stage gate process to say, before there's a go, no-go decision, should we have our inputs or our perspective heard? We're looking into that. We haven't put that into play here yet. My expectation is that would down the road be a best practice we seek to go after.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're out of time for more questions. I said it's a great presentation. We can go on another 30 minutes going through these questions, and I'd love to hear your answers on it. But unfortunately, we're out of time. I said I'll forward these over to you, and you can maybe answer some individually. There will be a day-long topic covering new products forecast on our online seminars during the month of September. I'll actually be presenting those. So some people who wanted to talk specifically about some of the KPIs and models, I'm going to go over those in that seminar. So I invite you to be part of that as well. The answer to the question at the beginning of items that are considered new, this includes line and market extensions. The average absolute forecast there at the SKU level, lag 1, according to IBF studies, was around 53%. Other studies looking at disruptive products and items that are new to the world, for companies, it's over 60% error. So if you're not alone if you're seeing these high errors at your company as well. So with that, I thank everybody. You will be getting a survey about an hour later after we close this off. Please fill out the survey. You're going to get a copy to all these slides. If you have specific questions on some acronyms that were a little bit confusing people, please ask those. Maybe John can clear those up and give you a little more detail about specific slides if necessary. But with that, it was a great time, great presentation, John. Thank you again, and thank you everybody for joining.